and the pianist for this presentation. We are really happy to be presenting this lecture recital entitled Women Composers Across Cultures and Centuries, and is being co-sponsored by MCC's Commonwealth Honors Program, so we're very grateful to them for that. Unbelievably, it wasn't until the late 20th century that people cared about music by women composers. Before that, they were not taken seriously and their compositions were rarely performed. Fortunately today, modern women composers don't face the same prejudices that their predecessors did, and today people are really interested in rediscovering the music of wonderful women composers, and the works are being published and performed. I'm delighted to be joined in this program by Dr. Anatole Wieck, who will play the violin, and we have chosen 5 women composers to feature. They're from different centuries, countries, and cultures, and talk a little bit about some of the obstacles they faced and how they dealt with these challenges. So I'd like to welcome our guest artist and invite him to talk about the first composer.
Well, we will start our concert with Isabella Leonarda with her sonata for keyboard and violin. And there's a photo of one of her portraits. I should say right away that unlike the portraits of members of the royal family, which were supposed to glamorize them, so since she was a nun, no effort like that was made. In fact, it was a typical nun, just paint her the way she is. Now, she lived a long life. She died at the age of 84, which is pretty long at the time. And it's impossible to say whether she was in her 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s, could be any of these years. Now, another misconception could be her station in life. She was a nun, so we immediately think, get thee to a nunnery. So we think that it was life of deprivation or nothing of that sort. She came from a noble family, which probably funded this church to some extent, and she was privileged to be, basically today we would consider an artist in residence. Of course, she did all her church duties, so she had different positions, including Mother Superior, in which I'm sure was quite a bit of work, but at the same time, so she could dedicate herself to her art. And it seems to be being a nun was a great place where she could just dedicate herself to creative efforts. And she wrote quite a few works for quite a few vocal works, and unlike other women composers, which were few, he also wrote some instrumental works for violin and other instruments, and probably from the way she wrote, we can assume that she was a very good violinist. So probably we should start. Okay, originally I was going to bring a Baroque instrument, but I changed my plans. I was gonna drive in the car so I could load my instruments and put them in the trunk. So I ended up riding the bus. You know, of course, having 3 or 4 instruments would be too much. So all I did is just brought my violins. But I did bring the Baroque bow. Now, there is a difference between Baroque violin and modern violin. It's shaped a little bit different, but the shape creates a very subtle effect. The biggest difference is that all the people that specialize in Baroque music and play according to performance practices of 17th and 18th century, they play on God strings. And today, the strings we use, they're made out of space-age material. So what you have, if I would bring my Baroque violin, it would just look a little bit differently, but the strings would definitely be made out of sheep gut or beef gut, and the strings on modern violin usually made out of perlon. Perlon, that's the material that the astronauts use to tether themselves to the spaceship. So when they go to take a walk in the space, they usually tethered by perlon. Well, perlon is used as a core for the string, and this core is wrapped in some kind of metal. Usually it could be tungsten, it could be silver, sometimes it's gold, and or other materials such as aluminum and others. So basically that's the difference. But I made that was no problem to bring a Baroque bow. It probably makes a bigger difference for the sounds besides the strings. And the Baroque bow is shaped a little differently. If I would make it really, really tight, then it would look a little bit like a hunting bow. Yeah? So it's shaped this way. And the modern bow shaped differently. You can easily see that. And the reason is because when the bow is shaped in this manner, you can put much more pressure when you tighten the bow. In fact, it was Italian violinist that lived in France. His name was Violin. He conceived the idea, and he went to a bow maker who was famous at that time, and he said, I would like you to make the bow that is shaped in this manner, and then you would be able to tighten much more than the bow that we have right now. Well, the bow maker said, I don't think it would work because all those bows would warp or snap because of too much tension. So, but nonetheless, he decided to go ahead with the project, and he tried, and sure enough, all the bows became warped or worse, were broken in no time. But he thought it's a great idea that might be very popular in the future because as the violin repertory was developing, they were writing pieces that required more sound. And also the violinists began to play with the newly created orchestras. We're talking about end of 18th century, beginning of 19th century. So he did not give up this idea. And once he walked in the harbor, and he saw that a ship was unloading barrels that were huge, they were enormous. So he went to the captain, he says, well, what is it for? Why do you have barrels so big? He says, well, we're going to get our great French wine and take it to Brazil. And we're using Brazilian wood called Pernambuco that is extra strong, and he said it's also very flexible, so that's why the barrels are so huge. So they will be able to hold all this wine and will not break. He says, well, that's great. Can I get some of this wood? He said, sure, I have a few pieces of it. So he gave him the wood, and so the bow maker tried that particular wood, and it worked. So now since then, all the bows all the modern bows made out of Pernambuco. And the Baroque bows made out of different woods, made out of snake wood, which works a lot. So that's so different materials used for Baroque bows, but they of course much softer. But for Baroque music, it's okay because the volume was not as important. So maybe we can proceed.
So I am not playing a harpsichord, as you can see. These pieces for Baroque violin and Continuo, which means harpsichord and cello. And we have a harpsichord in low, but we don't have one here. So we're using a keyboard with a harpsichord sound, so you get the idea of what it should have sounded like. Germany. And our next composer, Clara Schumann. She was the wife of the famous Romantic composer Robert Schumann. She was a wonderful pianist and fine composer. She wrote lots of piano music. She wrote songs. She wrote chamber music, so music for a small group of instruments, choral music, and piano concerto. She was also a great champion of her husband's music, traveled around Europe playing his music as well as other composers of the time. During her lifetime, she was regarded, she was celebrated as an accomplished pianist, and people really didn't think much about her compositions. And she seemed to realize that she'd never be recognized as a composer, so she concentrated on being a pianist and promoting her husband's music. I have an interesting quote she wrote later on in life. So here's what she wrote. Quote, "I once believed that I possessed creative talent, but I have given up this idea. A woman must not desire to compose. There has never yet been one able to do it. Should I expect to be the one?" So she accepted that she would not be recognized as a composer, and she would make her contribution mainly by promoting her husband's music and then also by being a pianist. Today, of course, she's recognized as a wonderful composer. Her music is frequently performed. And we're going to play two very charming romances for violin and piano. So Bye to the Harpsichord and Hello to the Modern Piano. These are really lovely pieces, and my music appreciation students here will recognize characteristics from the Romantic era. Long flowing phrases, use of rubato, just a flowing, flexible rhythm, kind of a melancholic mood, and the second romance we're going to play contains a lot of virtuosic writing for the piano. I should mention these pieces were composed for a salon setting, so a small setting like this, like a small concert hall, or even someone's living room. So we hope you enjoy these two romances by Clara Schumann. She was a multifaceted musician. She was a magnificent pianist. She was also successful as an opera singer for a time, and she was also a composer. She was born in Venezuela in 1853, began playing the piano when she was 4 years old. When she was 8, she and her family moved to the United States, and she made her New York debut as a pianist. And she was such a sensation that President Lincoln invited her to come to the White House to play for him. When she was a teenager, she and her family moved to Europe, and she met lots of wonderful composers everyone thought she was a magnificent pianist. She had great fame and great success. However, they thought she didn't play quite like a woman should. I have some interesting quotes here. And first one comes from a renowned composer, Ignaz Paderewski, and he once commented, quote, Madame Teresa Carreño was a very, shall I say, strong pianist, even too strong for a woman, end of quote. Here's my favorite one. The German music critic Ferdinand Voll wrote, quote, in her touch there is often something like violence, denying those especially womanly attributes, loving submission, tenderness, and gentleness, end of quote. So it's ironic that after years of people complaining that the women pianists were too gentle, they were too delicate, she was faulted for being too strong. Anyway, so as a composer, she wrote 40 piano pieces. She wrote a string quartet, she wrote several songs, she wrote a serenade for string orchestra, and a celebratory hymn in honor of Bolivar. I should mention, and this is very important, that although she was very well known as a pianist, she was also very well known as being a very dynamic kind of woman. She spoke 5 languages fluently, she was very charming, and she was regarded as being very attractive. So her personal life was really, really scandalous for the time she lived because she had 4 husbands and 7 children. So this was definitely not considered a good thing for a woman back then. Now, as I say, she wrote quite a bit of piano music in general, but most of her compositions were written before her first marriage at the age of 20. After that, she became busy with these various husbands and children, so she really didn't have a lot of time to write. And she concentrated on being a concert pianist. It was also a way she could support her family. You know, in between the husbands, she had to support all the kids. So she could do this as a concert pianist. So she was recognized that way. She never really received that much recognition as a composer. I'm going to play an example of a piece she wrote for the salon, again a small setting. And this was inspired by a Latin American dance rhythm she grew up hearing as a child when she lived in Venezuela. Although it's entitled Highland Souvenir of Scotland, it makes use of a Caribbean habanera dance rhythm. Now, musicologists claim that the origin of this Cuban habanera was a country dance in Scotland from the 16th and 17th century that made its way to the New World, to Cuba and the Caribbean, where it was combined with African rhythms and it became the Cuban or Caribbean habanera. Very lively dance, that's what you're going to hear next. What's interesting is this particular dance rhythm made its way back to Spain, where it became the Spanish habanera, which was much more sensual and was used in the opera Carmen. So this rhythm, how many have heard that rhythm? So that's the Spanish, more sensual habanera. The Caribbean habanera that inspired this Carreño is much more dramatic and energetic, and that's what you're going to hear in this particular piece.
So the next piece on the program is Adoration by Florence Price. A few words about her. She was an American composer, lived in the 20th century, and she actually did achieve success because one of her symphonies was performed by the Chicago Symphony, but other attempts to get her works performed unfortunately didn't pan out. One of them was an attempt to have the Boston Symphony play her symphonic work. She sent the music and wrote a letter to Kusevitsky, to which he never replied. And altogether, her work was kind of forgotten. But in 2009, in one particular place, it was an abandoned house, they suddenly discovered a whole bunch of works by Florence Price, and they began to look at it, and the musicologists realized that she actually was a very fine composer, and they started playing her works. So now there's a revival of her compositions, and hopefully you'll agree that's a very beautiful short composition that she wrote. by Grażyna Bacewicz, a Polish composer. She was a student of very famous French teacher, Nadia Boulanger, and my own interpretation of kind of what she tried to do. It was very customary when it came to composing for a teacher to suggest that the student would take a work by Beethoven or Mozart and write a composition that would be basically modeled on the works of this kind of masters. And already Debussy thought that, it doesn't really work. One of the students that asked him, which symphony of Beethoven should I select as my model? And he said it's a waste of time. You should go to the top of the mountain, watch the sunset, and then reflect it in your music. Well, Nadia Boulanger was of a similar kind of opinion. She had students from all over the world, including this country, and she encouraged them to study the music of their native land, something that people are not familiar. And basically she implied that there was already a Beethoven, we don't need another Beethoven. And there was probably not enough music that was based on music of this country, which would be the folk music from the South, or African American music, or music from Latin America. So she encouraged her students that came from this part of the world to study their national music. So I think Grażyna Bacewicz probably heard something like this as well. And so she wrote pieces that reflected Polish folk music. And so we're going to play a piece called Oberek, which is a traditional folk tune. Now I should mention that besides established composer, she was very well regarded in Poland, so she was also a highly sought after violinist of her time. All right, Oberek 1 by Grażyna Bacewicz.
questions, comments? We hope you do. So any questions? Anybody want to start us off with some questions or thoughts about these composers? Yes.
Do you know if she remained in Portland? Because I see she was there through the wars.
She remained, well, she traveled a lot, but she passed away. And as far as I know, I need to reread her biography, but as far as I know, she continued to play and write music. She did have an car accident in 1952, and after that she couldn't play anymore, but she continued to compose. She died relatively young, she was only 6 years old.
But she was greatly supported by Poland, so they were always performing her symphonic pieces, her larger works. So she was constantly being played there. Unlike the older composers who didn't manage to get their compositions performed, the modern composers do. There's really no distinction now between men and women composers like there was back, before, before the 20th century. So that's a good question. Any other questions? Yes.
You played pieces that were Baroque as well as modern, all with a Baroque bow, which has different characteristics, including the way that you hold the bow, the bowing technique. So what sort of challenges are there in playing a newer repertoire with a Baroque bow?
Well, I think they challenge us knowing the style. I remember when I was a student, the word from the very famous violinists of the time, which included people that I admired very much, Isaac Perlman, and he said, this Baroque stuff, it's a fad, it will go away, and just mark my word, he said. I remember that very clearly. He said in 5 years nobody will remember it. This will go on. And of course, at that time, at school, we went to Juilliard school, they didn't even bother with Baroque performance practices, except to keep the word.
Right.
And
Now they do. They have a very fine Baroque.
yes, they changed their
historical
mind very,
performances.
very quickly. Sometime in the 2003 or 2004,
Really?
they started the Baroque department, and now they hired very excellent, great teachers. So right now they have a program going on.
Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question about the transition from harpsichord to piano as the predominant keyboard instrument. Can you say a little bit about how
Sure.
that
So the
evolved?
harpsichord was for the Baroque era, and because the left hand, the lower parts were not that prominent, you always had a lower instrument, usually a cello. Could be double bass, could be bassoon. They would play, and then you had the forte piano, which could play loud and soft. That would be the classical period, Haydn, Mozart, early Beethoven, but it could not play the huge dynamic range of the modern piano can. So that's why if you hear a Mozart sonata being played, you don't hear ever fortissimos. You hear, even on the modern piano, it's kind of mezzo forte, kind of modeling what the piano could do, the forte piano at the time. Then when the Romantic era came, so Clara Schumann's time, Teresa Carreño's time, you had this modern piano. They could could play it very, very soft and also could play very dramatically. And so obviously piano music changed quite dramatically because you had this instrument that could do many more things and create many more colors. Any other questions about women composers or getting their music out there or anything? Yes?
Did they ever figure out if some of the men got credit for when a woman composed?
That was true of certainly Robert Schumann. They've discovered that some of the songs that we credit Robert Schumann were actually written by his wife. And some of the smaller piano pieces. So probably not the larger works, but definitely smaller works. And also they were a source of inspiration. So Robert Schumann would play through his works first for his wife, or would give him the scores, and she'd make suggestions. So definitely, we know a couple of cases where pieces of hers actually were labeled his. But even more than that, there's a lot of influence of women composers on men composers.
Was that ever fixed?
Yes, it was fixed. So now we know which ones are hers and which ones are not. Yeah. Any other? Yes.
So, I know that in literature they have some authors that would put their names as initials or not, just so that they wouldn't be identified as women authors.
Mm-hmm.
Did the same
Not so much. No, I think a lot of, and this is my opinion, I think a lot of them just accepted that they were writing for themselves, for their family, and they were not going to be recognized. And one of the things interesting to consider is in classical music, you're judged on the big works, on the symphonies, the concertos, the operas. Women didn't write those until maybe the turn of the century, the past century. And so they were writing for their friends, they were writing for their family, a lot of them were pianists or violinists, and they were playing their own music. So it wasn't like in literature they were trying to publish it, they were trying to get an orchestra to perform it. The exception being Amy Beach from Boston. She actually managed to get the Boston Symphony to perform several of her symphonies. In her case, her husband didn't want her performing the piano as long as he was alive. He thought that was like nice for her to exhibit herself in public. So it's fine that she composed, but no, don't play in front of people. So there were all these restrictions to various composers. Any other question? Then yes.
We ended here in 1969 with her.
Mm-hmm.
Are there modern day piano
There are lots of them,
composers?
and one of the reasons we ended there is because after that, there's no distinction. If you look at the artists in residence at the New York Philharmonic and the Boston Symphony, they're men or women. I mean, no one thinks about Gabrielle Lena Frank necessarily as a woman composer, just a great composer. There's lots and lots of wonderful 21st century composers. You get their list of their names, you don't think, oh, that's a female from something. It isn't. So they're not special anymore. So there's really not that distinction. The only place left for that distinction in classical music are conductors. You don't see women orchestral conductors. But for composers, if you look at the list of the best people from the 21st century, it's equal number of men and women. It's really not an issue anymore. But it certainly was for centuries, which is what we were really highlighting.
Are women banned from conducting, or it's just not something they
It's just not
gravitate
something that the audiences seem to respond to, or they're not hired. I mean, I don't know. But take a look at the U.S. There's one woman conductor of a major symphony. It's the Atlanta Symphony. She's from France. That's it. So it's just not something that's still, I think that's the last bastion to be toppled. And I'm sure it will happen soon, because a lot of women are being trained as conductors. It's just they don't get the opportunities that. Any other? Yes?
With Teresa's music, there seemed like there was so much plagiarism of so many parts of her music. When you were playing it, it just seemed like so many similarities to so much music now that's being produced that sounds like her music.
Well, I think it's because she was making use of that Caribbean habanera rhythm, which is still, which has influence today as well. And I just chose that piece because it was one reflective of Latin American repertoire and rhythms, but she wrote a lot of other pieces. She wrote a lot of virtuosic music that really showed off her technical ability. But one thing I can talk about her a little bit, because she's someone I did research on. When I started researching her, I'd heard of her as a pianist, because I'm a pianist, obviously, and she's one of the great pianists of the late 19th century, early 20th century. I'd heard of her as a pianist. I had no idea she wrote music, because we learned that. We just learned she was a great pianist. And so then when I discovered that she actually was writing music, I thought, well, I want to get some of this music. It was unavailable. And we're talking early 2000s, and you could not find her music anywhere. So a musicologist friend of mine said there'd been an article written in a musicological journal, said that all of her music was in a special collection at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York, because her biographer was on the faculty there and had the university buy all of her music. So I, of course, got on the phone, I called these libraries. No one but me was remotely interested in this. And they said, come, So I drove to Poughkeepsie, and there was all of this music, manuscripts of hers, first editions that were out of print since the 1920s. And they let me copy anything. So I copied 7 pieces, and then Hildegard Publishing Company, at that time, beginning of the 20th century, was working on releasing women composers. So this is the edition that I released, 7 of her pieces. Very different styles. So the Almanetta one was one of them, but there were a lot of other waltzes and virtuosic pieces there. And then in the introduction, I put where you could find the rest of her music, and so a lot of pianists went. So now you can get her music. I recorded a CD of her compositions. Other pianists did too. So it's just a small example of women who people didn't even know they were composers. They couldn't get their music, and now they can. You can hear their music online. You can get their music in print. IMSLP and find the older women composers, so it's not that difficult anymore. Yes?
Do you have any examples of early Asian women composers?
Early Asian women composers? I do not, but do you know any?
No. Well, I think probably when it comes to women composers, they had even more issues with that than. Although one piece, unfortunately, I didn't play today.
Well, it's contemporary.
Contemporary.
Yeah. A lot of contemporary Asian women composers.
Yes.
I would imagine that it's sort of like me with Teresa Carreño, kind of being interested in finding out where it was. The same thing is being done in Asia, and it hasn't quite filtered to the general public here yet. But I'm sure there are. So they're, waiting to be discovered. So maybe the next concert you can find an early Asian women composer.
Well, one of my students who actually gave a recital here last year playing Chinese music, she just gave a doctoral dissertation. She defended her dissertation, and there was 3,000 years of history. There was not one woman composer.
Right. That was the Silk Road also, right?
Right.
So there might be, but they have to be discovered. Some special collection has to be explored there.
Well, that's a good topic.
Yeah, we can ask her.
That's right.
Ask her, maybe she would know.
Yeah.
So get back to us. Any other questions? You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much for coming. So look into women composers. Yes, one
Just
last.
want to thank you and the World of Music for the concerts.
Oh,
Yes.
thank you. I did not say you. 25th season, we're celebrating 25 years next year. We'll have a celebration that we'll let you know about. So there's a concert coming up. Here's a good example. Wonderful pianist who's coming, and she's playing a piece by Clara Schumann, another piece by Amy Beach. Not because they're women composers, because they're wonderful composers she wants to include in her music. So today you will hear, just look at the program, you don't all see the first names. A lot of women composers do that. All right, so thank you so much. Hope to see you the next.